Hi, I'm Scott MacLeod, and I'm going to offer a social history of the internet. My method's going to include relating a story of how the internet developed, an analysis of this story, and then a look at factors that led to the development of the internet as well. What were the raw materials of this revolution? Well, in previous industrial revolutions, raw materials included energy, iron, coal, electricity, chemicals, telecommunications, etc. In the information revolution, it is neither silicon, nor talent, nor money. The most important raw material is information. It's knowledge. What were the exact characteristics of this revolution? Well, the most important feature is that knowledge is value. And where is knowledge? Sometimes in universities, sometimes in research centers. It's in scientists. Knowledge is generated by human minds and bodies. So in this information revolution, human minds are the critical source of value. And this is the founding concept of these talks. The transistor was the first innovation that led in a significant way to this information technology revolution. It's the founding discovery in 1947-48 at Bell Labs in New Jersey. And what the transistor does is it enables a small electrical voltage to control a flow of electric current. In computers, transistors act as a tiny, speedy on-off switch. Transistors were discovered by three people, all of whom received the Nobel Prize in 1956. William Shockley was the leader of the team, with John Bardeen and Walter Brattain. They saw extraordinary possibilities in the transistor, and they created a whole network of scientists at Bell Labs. But Bell Labs could not take advantage of it. They were a telecommunications monopoly. Bell Labs couldn't go into another business due to antitrust laws. Other businesses could pick it up, but other businesses weren't interested. For example, RCA and Raytheon in the 50s said no. They were focused on vacuum tubes, and that was enough. So Shockley, the leader of the team who invented the transistor, tried to create his own lab. And that didn't work out as well. So Shockley came to Palo Alto, California, because his mother was there. He was depressed, he had a Nobel Prize and nothing else. This migration to Silicon Valley was essential to the development of the network society. It was the source of knowledge migration, and it was purely fortuitous. Shockley later became a professor at Stanford, but at the time no one was interested in the transistor. Beckman Instruments was interested. Arnold Beckman, who had started this company, who was a physical chemist, was involved in the early electronics companies in the Silicon Valley area, and he had a mid-sized company. He saw the potential in the transistor. Bell Labs couldn't go into another business, the chip business, for example, due to antitrust laws. Other businesses could pick it up, the transistor, but businesses weren't interested. RCA, AT&T, Raytheon said no, for example. Vacuum tubes were enough. So Shockley decided to create his own lab. He came to Palo Alto, California, because his mother was there. He was depressed, he had a Nobel Prize and nothing else. This migration to Silicon Valley was essential to the development of the network society, both as a source of knowledge and in that it was purely fortuitous. it was serendipitous. Shockley later became a professor at Stanford, but no one at the time still was interested in the transistor. Arnold Beckman, who ran a mid-sized company, Beckman Instruments, was interested in the Silicon Valley area. He saw the potential in the transistor. Beckman and Shockley started Shockley Transistor Corporation in Palo Alto in 1956. Shockley could do that because a whole network of Palo Alto electronic companies was forming at the time, and because Stanford was supporting entrepreneurial companies. Stanford had an entrepreneurial attitude. All the inventions that came out of this were accidental. Frederick Terman was a researcher who wanted a PhD in electrical engineering, went to MIT and got his PhD in the 1920s. He worked at MIT after that. He got tuberculosis and went back to California. He decided to take a position at Stanford and later became a dean there. He wasn't a great researcher or engineer, but he could identify great minds. Frederick Terman, Professor Terman, was experimenting on radar technologies leading to electronics. He asked why engineers didn't make something practical. And he was encouraging students to start businesses near Stanford. At the same time, William Hewitt and David Packard were Stanford PhD students working on the oscillator. An oscillator makes an electronic wave, which can be used in audio synthesizers, for example. Terman got together $1,000 out of his own pocket, which wasn't easy then, and gave this money to William Hewlett and David Packard, who started the Hewlett-Packard Company in 1939. Hewlett-Packard's devices became very valuable after World War II started. They were manufacturers of test and measurement instruments, and the oscillator was their first product used in radios. They sold millions to the defense industry. After World War II, Hewlett-Packard was very established. Terman became provost of Stanford, and this is an example which could be amplified. It became a model for the way companies can start. At Stanford, Terman was convinced to use assets that Stanford had, namely land, to start companies. And he helped to start the Stanford Industrial Park in 1951. Stanford University therefore was able to provide faculty and students. Any land that was rented had to be approved by Stanford. They offered long-term leases to companies. And Terman convinced established companies to become the first tenants there. During the 1950s, under the Stanford Initiative, a cluster of innovative companies developed around Stanford. So Shockley arrives in the 1950s. The cluster of companies on the West Coast are not up to the level of East Coast companies, however. Shockley decided to go into microelectronics and brought the best minds with him. The minds being the raw material of this revolution. He brought them from Bell Labs. He brought 8 young engineers. 6 of them were from Bell, and 2 were from other institutions who wanted to work with Shockley. One was Bob Noyce, later called the mayor of Silicon Valley, who went on to work on integrated circuits at Intel. Noyce ran both Fairchild Semiconductor, a very important early company, and Intel. Shockley's company failed. Was he a genius? He was a horrible person. He became a prominent professor. He tried to demonstrate biological inferiority of women and African Americans. But a genius? He was stubborn. He wanted to work on microcircuits, but not in silicon, rather in gallium arsenide. Young engineers at the time, many, however, wanted to work in silicon. When the 8 engineers who Shockley had brought with him from the East Coast left the Shockley Transistor Corporation, it became an empty shell. And that's when Shockley began to work as a professor at Stanford. These engineers, these 8 engineers, invented microelectronics and also migrated knowledge to Silicon Valley. These young engineers were all part of Fairchild conductors as well. And each later split and created their own company. They were called also the Fairchild 8 and the Traitorous 8. They included Gordon Moore, Sheldon Roberts, Eugene Kleiner, Bob Noyce, Victor Greenwich, Julius Blank, Gene Horney, and Jay Last. Fairchild Semiconductor led to Intel and AMD, etc. In all, about 140 companies were spun off from Fairchild Semiconductor in the 1950s. In 1959, integrated circuits were invented. The Defense Department made up about 50% of the market for these semiconductors. And the Defense Department helped to provide research programs for microelectronics development. But from the 1970s onward, military markets came to represent less than 20% of total sales of Silicon Valley. In 1957, Sputnik was launched by the Soviets. It was the first human-made satellite circling the Earth. And it represented the Soviet system in space, overtaking Americans. The context of the Cold War led to the Defense Department contributing great amounts of resources to technological development. In 1959, there was a race to the moon. Nothing could be done there, but it was the competitive aspect which contributed to the Defense Department's interest in the development of new technologies. If something could be done there, of course, it was worth being there. After the extraordinary events of 1959, the military got further involved with technology. So you have microelectronics, computing and telecommunications on the one hand, and genetic engineering on the other hand. A little about genetic engineering. In 1973, genetic research started in hospitals. When the University of California, San Francisco, and Stanford experimented with splicing, gene splicing, they introduced a new technology. Cultural influences. The culture of the information revolution was very important to its development. Culture influenced thinking what to do with these innovations. And the key aspects of the culture that shaped these developments in the 1950s and later were that, for one, it was decentralized. Information processing, information generating, these innovations were decentralized in their production. Secondly, the culture led to making things smaller and smaller. Integration became very, very important. How many lines you could put on a chip was guiding the development, for example, of these of the information revolution. Thirdly, the information revolution in many ways opened up source code to the public. It made it possible for the public to participate, contribute, and write code. Each of these approaches was entirely different from those at IBM and AT&T, for example. Hacker culture played a very important role in shaping the information revolution. Hackers from all kinds of origins, including students, university researchers, engineers, and all kinds of alternative types in the San Francisco Bay Area, contributed to this culture. It was essential in the personal computer revolution and later in the internet revolution. Countercultural types and hackers are critical sources of innovation because they innovate. They innovate for the sake of innovation, for their own pleasure, and for their own use value. Countercultural types, hackers, and libertarians provide the unexpected openings that the system, economic, institutional, cannot generate by itself. California culture, even more than US culture at large, and the university culture are full of these types. Plus, the libertarian individualist ideology of doing it by myself and for myself was very significant in the shaping of the information revolution. So, the most extraordinary cultural influences concerning the technology revolution were the entrepreneurial attitude of Stanford and Stanford's contribution, that technology migrated from research centers, major research centers on the East Coast, and that military money shaped the market. And lastly, the contribution of the Cultural Revolution from the counterculture. So to be analytic and systematic about this social history of the internet, what created Silicon Valley as the site of this revolution? All regional economies are based on three things: raw material, capital, and labor. What was specific to Silicon Valley? In terms of raw materials, the specific contribution that Silicon Valley made was knowledge through knowledge and information generating capacity. It wasn't exactly through universities. It originally came from Bell Labs, and then it diffused. In terms of labor, Silicon Valley offered highly skilled labor. It offered technical and scientific labor. And these labor pools originated from Stanford and UC Berkeley and had a market origin. At the same time, in terms of gene splicing, Stanford, Maryland, Virginia, and Harvard were major centers. Silicon Valley culture was unique because of the ability to innovate by thinking new applications that weren't there before. Influences for this came directly from the culture of the 1960s. These included thinking differently, rebellion against the establishment. The culture of the 1960s didn't want revolution. They wanted their revolution. And culture was extremely important, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area. It led, for example, to alternative forms of computing linked to the personal computer. The personal computer. This computer that was originally called the microcomputer came directly from the Homebrew Computer Club in Sausalito, Menlo Park, and San Francisco, California. Finding codes that computers worked on. These hackers and early computer hobbyists created a world around a new language. Countercultural scientists like Stuart Brand, who put together the Whole Earth Catalog, brought the personal computer and the counterculture and the public together, for example. Folks like Stuart Brand provided a bridge between society and counterculture. Researchers in the Bay Area universities were essential to the development of the personal computer and the internet revolution. And producing research scientists became part of university policy. In, for example, the 1950s, Berkeley and Stanford produced less than half the PhDs than Harvard and MIT. And then Stanford decided to fund engineering. And Berkeley got money from the state for engineering and computer science. In the 1960s, Stanford and Berkeley produced 4 times as many PhDs compared with Harvard and MIT. So, in California, there was a deliberate government policy to support technology and this revolution as a business investment. Third, the capital problem. These technology businesses are risky because they are dependent on trying something new. Companies have to be stubborn and to keep trying. A startup fails 7 times on average. Venture capitalists like to give money to failures. Financial capital. In the 1960s, when the technology revolution was about to explode, no capital was available. So, 2 kinds of special capital developed. Capital which was designed to be lost, and capital which was defined as speculative. Money without expectation of return on it. Who can give money and not ever expect a return? The government. But why? Out of international pride and competition? No, because it does expect a return down the line. The government recognizes that the investment will or should come back. And what part of the government doesn't care about costs, only performance? Military investment. When you have to survive, you don't count money. What made Silicon Valley original was unlimited money from the military in the context of the Cold War. In this scenario, companies could fail. And if finally you might develop a microchip, you get military superiority. So it was purely a military strategy. And it worked out exactly that way. 20 years later, the US outperformed the Soviet Union completely by 1984. All the money that went into technology in the 1970s paid off. So that's money you can expect to lose. The second kind of capital, speculative capital, that which you are ready to lose, was also very important. Why? Because when you win, you really win big. So overall, in the 1990s, venture capital has increased bets by a factor of 7, counting potential losses. The reward came later. When the industry developed, people from the industry became rich. Venture capital money came originally from inside the industry. And then the industry started to work with other established firms. With raw materials, with special raw materials, in this case, knowledge, information, something else also happens to capital, to labor. when it's concentrated in one area, the San Francisco Bay Area, which was so unique. Professor Annalise Saxenian's book, Regional Advantage, compared the Boston and Silicon Valley areas in the 1960s and 1970s. And she showed how, in the 1960s, Boston was very, very far ahead in microelectronics, computers, the internet, new network technologies, and genetic engineering. Information revolution technologies. Saxenian shows that there are two key factors which led to the revolution clustering around these technologies. The first is the industrial structure of specific companies, which are suppliers, are a network of companies which are developing knowledge of what they do best. Universities do the same thing. Complex organizations around networks constitute themselves very similarly in a pattern throughout history, actually. Secondly, social networks also formed. Silicon Valley was made up of individuals. There was an ethos of building one's own company, doing one's own thing. People were required to sign confidentiality statements, for example. But in Silicon Valley, these were limited to 6 months. Otherwise, you couldn't find people to work for you. The edge was shifting so quickly around these social networks. Saxenian's contribution was to show that these social networks were made up of people, engineers, students, who would meet after work to talk about work. The key thing was a process of excitement about work. That network, in combination with people creating their own companies, played an enormous role. It created a milieu of permeability. Nothing was stable. And this was the missing link to understanding the information revolution culture documented in Saxenian's Regional Advantage. So why did this clustering occur, this milieu of innovation in the Silicon Valley area? Synergies were very, very important. Synergies are where 2 + 2 = 5, not 4. Because putting things together whose added value is more than things are as separate entities occurs due to interactions as well as to the added value from elements in the process. The fact that in Silicon Valley culture, people and companies could talk to one another generated a milieu of innovation. There was a cluster set of research centers, companies, venture corporations, labor markets, and professional organizations, which, through interactions, created synergy. So, despite the challenges of living in Silicon Valley, the traffic, the congestion, the cost of living, people keep coming to Silicon Valley. They get hooked and never get out. And this is the machine which is creating the revolution. The Japanese, by contrast, tried to reproduce the pattern unsuccessfully, perhaps because it wasn't organic. The last stage of this information technology revolution is global networking. This involves connecting to other places around the world with the same synergy and thereby generating capacity. This didn't happen in the same way as in Silicon Valley. Electronic companies originally started to produce chips in low-cost companies, particularly in Southeast Asia. The added value is really the ability to add knowledge for profits. What's critical is the ability to connect around the world to places such as Taiwan. So now there is a network in software in Bangalore, India, and in numerous other places around the world. These networks are generally organized through immigrant entrepreneurs. And they create, in a sense, or what is created, what occurs is a different kind of production system. Someone from India, China, Taiwan comes with an electrical engineering degree or gets an electrical engineering degree, stays, learns a trade, and creates a company, and then reestablishes contact with their countries. Through personal connections, Silicon Valley has established a worldwide network, but not to all places in the world. The worldwide network is a different kind of production system. In summary, the information technology revolution is a new paradigm of technological and socioeconomic organization. A paradigm is a cluster of interrelated technological and managerial innovations. A paradigm is a system where the elements need to come together with each other to progress in every field. This cluster is able to generate new products and processes, moving towards synergy and improving productivity. And it's from the development of the internet that this, and the information technology revolution, that this paradigm shift occurred.